Well, a very good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where in the world you are tuning in from. My name is Adrian Reed, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this afternoon or this evening's webinar. The topic today is one that you may or may not have thought much about before, you may or may not have heard much about before, but you've probably been impacted by it, whether or not you know it. We're going to talk about the tricky topic of nudging. And if you've not come across the term nudge before, the first time I came across it is actually in this book here, which is called Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein. And I really enjoyed reading it. And I had this book on my bookshelf for years and years, and I'd flick back on it every so often. And then I came across a tweet from Andy Tabberer, who I'm very pleased can join us today, that he'd given a presentation on nudging, and so I asked whether he would do a webinar, which he very kindly said yes to. So we're going to talk today about nudging or not nudging, and really what nudging is and the impact that it might have. So Andy, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Nice to meet everyone. I hope you're all right and coping well in what are singular times. I'm not going to sound precedented because everyone said that. I wanted to say just before I start is that I'm obviously at home. I have 3 children, so I've warned them not to come in. But in the unlikely event that they do, you may hear some noise, but I'm hoping that doesn't happen. So thank you for having me. The title, to nudge or not to nudge, I was saying to Adrian before that I thought I'd been very original with this title, but it turns out that anyone that's ever done a presentation ever in the history of mankind is all title. So excuse me for coming up with something so cliched. Who am I? I'm a delivery manager, which you may or may not know what that means. Adrian and I were talking about that as well. Essentially, I've worked in this business that we call delivery, project management, product management for 20 years. Probably like lots of you have had many different roles, and they all now seem to merge into one. I'm most often heard saying I'm too old for this, which I'm sure many of you are. But I'm not too old for nudges, because it's areas of work, areas like this that I think are really, they keep me wanting to do what I do, and that's how I got into this. Learning about nudges is just out of interest. I'm not a psychologist, although as I put here, I really think that organizations will be moving towards this in the future, that having a psychologist work in your company is going to be a good thing. As I said, I'm not an expert, I'm merely curious. And if you're on Twitter, I'm at Andy Tabberer on Twitter. I just thought I'd mention that because I meet, like I did with Adrian, a lot of interesting people. And if you want to carry on this conversation afterwards, then you can find me on there. Right, so what am I going to talk about? The first bit will be a bit of background about what nudges are, where they've come from, how you might have seen them before. I then want to talk about some experiments that we tried in my workplace. I no longer work there, I'm at a different company, but when I gave this presentation originally, that was one of the reasons for doing it, was to share 6 things that we tried, which you might want to. Then there'll be some reflection on what we learn and what I'd like you to take away from our experiments, and then some discussion about what nudges right now. We're going to have to talk about the C word, coronavirus, because nudges have come into the press recently, and about the whole nudge theory not being particularly effective when it comes to crisis, a pandemic. So we can touch on that as well, and then open it up to discussion around nudges in the workplace, but things that are happening right now. Now, this all started, this journey was, as it says on the bottom of the slide, someone gave me this because they knew I was interested in learning about new things. Now, this is EAST. Now, EAST is, as you can see, stands for easy, attractive, timely, and social. This is a report put together by the Nudge Unit, the Behavioural Insights team, which was a government department, now is actually a separate business. And this is put together to help people that create policy come up with a way of doing that will nudge people to make better decisions for themselves. And then the book that Adrian brandished, I also have my copy here. Nudge, and also Thinking Fast and Slow, which if you haven't read it, I recommend it highly, but it will take you 6 months to read. I think I have to warn you about that.
Andy, it looks like you liked it so much you broke the spine.
Yeah, yeah, I was constantly referring to it. It took me 6 months to read it on a train, commuting every day. But what Thinking Fast and Slow will give you everything you need to know about bias and psychology and behavioral economics. Nudge is like almost like a summary and written in a way that people like me can understand. So if you want to know about nudges and quickly gain enough understanding to try experimenting, try nudge. But I'd recommend Thinking Fast and Slow because of the many, many, many examples of how weird and unusual human beings are and how easy we are to manipulate, which is one of the reasons that nudges has come about. Right, so what is a nudge? As I said, I think many people associate it with this book, but it's been around for an age, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. I just don't think we had a very catchy name for what a nudge is, but they're everywhere. In the book Nudge, they talk about the authors talk about something called libertarian paternalism, which is a mouthful, and it's also two conflicting ideas. It's very much a USA thing, in that the libertarian movement around freedom to choose, and paternalism, which is seen as, I suppose, like big government, which is the state or state actors or people trying to influence the population or people to do things that are good for themselves. And there's a real tension in America, and that's why combining those two words together was the start of this whole nudge theory. And from that, there are sort of two definitions that come around. The first is self-conscious attempt to move people in directions that will make their lives better. That's from Nudge. Helping people to make better choices for themselves and society, that's from the Nudge unit, which is the behavioral insights team. Thaler, one of the authors, was actually instrumental in setting up that unit. So even though it's a different definition, it definitely has its roots in the original book and one of the authors. Now, I've put mine in there. I might have read that somewhere, so I'm not claiming it to be my own, but the way I think of nudges is helping people to be present in the moment, so that what are the long-term consequences? What is it you're trying to make me do? Who's it going to affect? And what feedback might I need to make a better decision? There are many things that but you want that person to be in the moment to make a good decision for themselves. A nudge involves something called a choice architect and choice architecture, which I'm just going to read you the definition of those. So a choice architect is a person who has responsibility for organizing the context in which people make decisions, which I would argue we all are in some way, indirectly or directly, every day in almost everything we do, and that's something to be aware of. And choice architecture is designing choices that have a beneficial effect. And I think when we think of choice architecture, it's the particular arrangement of options so that you can influence people and what they do. You can nudge. That's taken from the book. So what form do nudges take? There are many. They're all around us. Disclosure of information, publishing tables on the top 10 polluters, messages you get, emails, text messages. You might get someone from HMRC asking you to pay your tax, and 90% of people pay tax on time, for example. Emojis are now being used by energy companies to help people regulate their use of gas and electricity by a smiley face or an unhappy face. Environmental reminders, so anything in your workplace or where you are around you, helping you to make better decisions. Default rules, which think of when you get a mobile phone, or in the olden days we used to download software and there's those defaults you have to go through. They're there to help you so you don't have to think. There's less hassle. They're very powerful, and there's been a lot of work done by which you can read about and hear about, helping people, especially in America, understand pensions and get the best pension possible, because the defaults that were being used before were absolutely rubbish or were random. There's supply and demand. So think of any time you go and book a holiday now, or you go and buy something, there's usually something pops up saying 7 people are looking at this, or this might go out of stock soon. That's someone trying to influence your behavior. Priming. It can even be a smell, a nudge. How many times have you walked past a restaurant or walked into a coffee shop and there's the smell, a waft of something? You're immediately like, I need to eat or drink. Well, that's deliberate. It can be questions, it can be cues. Visual prompts, posters and signs. We've seen a lot of those at the moment with things like coronavirus. Informal bets. There's a great site, which I'll talk about in a moment, which if you were to have a bet with a friend about losing weight over a year, that's a nudge, because you're so, and if you disclose your weight each month, that is a very good way of getting you to do something, because there is money involved. And labeling and packaging, which is something that, again, in the news a lot around food labeling. How you label a product, for example, it's 90% fat free, gives you the impression that it's something healthy and is nudging you towards buying it, whereas actually it's got 10% fat in it. So they can be good and they can be bad. I've got some examples here. The skip hole fly, which I guess only men would know about. It's the most famous nudge of all. It's all around the world. It's in men's urinals. You will see a little picture of a painted fly on the urinal, which is there to help men with their aim. And as a result, has decreased spillages by 80%. So it's saved an enormous amount of money. And that was trialed in Schiphol Airport. One of the engineers there came up with the idea. It's now all around the world. As I said, smells from takeaways. Defaults like organ donation and the DVLR scheme, LA scheme, so that you are opted in as the default to give your organs. HMRC are doing great work in getting people to pay their taxes by the types of reminders, positive reminders, with reinforcing social norms. Google do it whenever you try and attach an email and you don't put you use an email and you try and put an attachment and you miss it, or you share a document, it will say there's people in this document that don't have permissions. Your battery dying on your laptop is probably the best nudge I can think of, in that you go from being sedentary to sprinting across the room to plug in, just from a reminder. Polluter tables I've mentioned. Piggy bank, one of the oldest nudges. It's there, you put money in, but it's there to stop you. To get it open, you have to physically cut into it, wouldn't you, or pull the cork out. So it's something they're nudging you to make the right decision. Looking left and right when you're at traffic lights on the floor. Footprints for ticket barriers. Booking.com I mentioned, but stick.com is a website set up just for nudges to help people with health, exercise, saving money, which I suggest you check out. It's very good. Uses public disclosure, families as referees, informal betting as a way to help people achieve their goals. So when ought one to nudge? So this is from Nudge itself, the book, different things that you need to think about. There's not a checklist, as in you don't need to have all of them present, but they're just the type of situations where you might want to. People needing self-control, I think, is a very obvious one. We humans are terrible when it comes. Think of a time when you've been at a party and someone puts a bowl of peanuts next to you, and someone has to end up taking it away from you because you just keep taking. It's called going into automatic pilot or mindlessness, and that is a very it happens to all of us. So in those sort of situations are ripe for nudges. The space between the benefit and cost. Think of exercise versus eating junk food. If you eat junk food, the reward, the benefit is there straight away, but the cost of it's further down the line. And other way around for exercise, the pain is at the start and the cost comes later on. And it's closing that gap so you understand consequences, sin versus investment. Infrequent but important decisions, organ donation, HR schemes, pensions, feedback is one where it's not structured. If you have to make a decision and there's no easy way to get feedback on whether you're doing it right or wrong, then that's something that can be a nudge can help with. Again, complicated decisions we don't understand how they will pan out. Pensions, and I'll keep coming back to pensions because I think it's ripe for it in this country, is that so many things involved in financial decisions or difficult decisions at work. We don't always think through what's going to happen or what the options are, and each one of them what the outcome will be. And the last one is encouraging socially beneficial behaviour. So again, relevant for work. What do you want people to do? If there's something that will benefit the whole, then that's definitely right for a nudge. So thinking about a lot of the people here being people that love frameworks like I do, are there frameworks? Indeed, there are. There are two, and I've referred to them, but they've got helpful mnemonics. So EAST, easy, attractive, socially, and timely. Again, this is one of the authors of Nudge. EAST is very easy to use. It'll get you started very quickly. I've got a few, I'll mention a few of them because there are quite a lot of things they cover, and I want to give you an idea of what they do and also what the crossover is. So easy is around it's the effort, making it simple, and the power of defaults. Attractive is making the rewards or sanctions, making those attractive and timely. Socially is thinking about how you can get other people to perform the behavior so they can show it publicly, using the power of networks to get people to do things, getting people to make a commitment to other people. And timely is prompting people at the right moment when they're most receptive. And it's that cost versus benefits that I mentioned. And also helping people to plan their response to something. Nudge, you can see they've taken a bit of a liberty there with the I for incentives and made the capital N. So the first incentives, again, there's crossover there with having the right incentives for the right people at the right time. And that's also about loss and gains, and about how we feel gains, losses twice as hard, we feel them twice as hard as a gain. Understanding mappings, that's that linking between my choice, the options, my choice, and what the outcome will be, and helping people to then make those mappings for themselves and select the right option. Defaults, again, we've discussed that it's the path of least resistance. Think of things like auto renewal is another great example of a default. So give feedback, find a way to give timely feedback around an error being made or something being done well. And I guess we notice this more and more when we're using websites and tools online now, that we're told when we're doing things well and when we're not. Expect errors and design for them. Again, that's something that is becoming more widespread using web applications, which is what I work in, is you design for people to make mistakes and anticipate them and then help them if they do. Structure complex choices. So this is around things like mandatory settings, recommended choices, things like saying 70% of people did X, to help people to make sense of a lot of information. It's also what you'll find people like Netflix do and Amazon do. When you're presented with an enormous amount of information, they use, I can't remember, it's something filter, but there's a way of taking you through a series of complex choices down to narrow it down to something that you can understand and make the choice of. And you're presented with this regularly every day. So as I said, the things in common, there are a lot. They are around defaults and peer pressure and networks. Really, conforming is a key thing that goes across most. That's what you're really trying to get people to do, not just conforming to what you want them to do. And again, it's not, whether you use either of those or a combination of these, they're not tick box exercises. So you don't need to do all of them. It's just to give you an idea of what the type of things that are nudge, what they are and how you might apply them. Right, so what do we, so we're now switching over to the bit where we, in my company, we're a small company, we had a bit of a problem with our work culture in that it wasn't very open and honest. We needed to find ways to help people to nudge, especially a lot of young people I work with, to make better decisions for themselves, especially when other people weren't around. It's that moment, being present in the moment, I think is quite often being what you do when you're alone and you can make a decision that other people won't see straight away. So that was the definition we used for a nudge, which is things that will help people to be present in the moment. we use something called Trojan mice. I don't know if you're aware of what those are, but I can share something afterwards. Essentially, what that means is that you have small, very simple, quick, easy experiments that are safe to fail, and you do many of them, and we did 6, with the idea of finding out, they could all fail, but you watch to see which one works best, and then that's the one that you go with. Little changes in context that have a big influence on work culture. So that's the approach that we took. So there were 4 steps that we went through. So the behavior to change and why. So looking at what it was that was the problem, then understanding it in its context. And that was about watching what was happening, getting some perspective. I put Gemba mat there because another concept that I've come across looking into nudges. Gemba mat was being stood it's having a mat. I think like most things, it comes from Japan. It comes from someone walking around with a mat rolled up under their arm, walking around a factory and then placing it down and standing still for 30 minutes to see what they see, and then to see how things are working, and then they can go away and see if there's a way of improving it. So we did a similar thing. Wherever we could, we would try and observe the behavior that we were looking to change to get that context. We then designed the nudge, using the principles that I referred to earlier on. We use the nudge and mnemonic. And then we experimented, more agile, experiment, inspect and adapt and test. And don't just assume it will work, because it didn't in a couple of instances, and we had to amend things. So I did actually remember the mapping. So that was a note to myself, because I didn't the last time I did the presentation. So where you'll see the mapping and the letters of the alphabet, it's referring to the nudge, incentives, understanding, mappings, default, give feedback, expect errors, and structure complex choices. Right, so the first we came up with was something called the jar of goodwill. This was actually just a jar which we filled with dried beans. We called it the jar of goodwill. And what this nudge concerned with is we were missing missing deadlines and not keeping our promises to clients. And this is when I worked in an agency, digital agency, and that was costing us dearly. I suppose the outcome was that it was causing us a lack of trust and pushing clients out the door, because we weren't doing what we'd said we'd do. So the jar of goodwill, the idea was to have it filled to begin with. This is how much goodwill we have with the client. And then if we let the client down and we didn't keep a promise or missed a deadline, it was very simple, to a handful of beans out and put it to one side. And then you'd have a visual clue that was in the office on the side, that every time we took something out, that meant we were losing goodwill. And if we got to about halfway, then we could see there was real trouble. And that was very effective. I mean, it almost worked immediately with some people. Just seeing something there that if you didn't do it, it meant that it would be visible. It's public disclosure, and people can see that and because it was a small company, you would know who it was that was working on with certain clients. So it was a very quick way of making people make better choices for themselves. We had one, so this one's called Buzz Off, the nudge. This was around, probably like many of you, especially at the moment, you have a disruptive, lengthy, unruly and waffly meetings. It was a real problem where we worked, everyone talking over each other, lots of people giving criticism, sat back with their arms folded, so we had to find a way to get people to encourage feedback, listen when other people were talking. So I just so happened to see these 4 buzzers. I think I bought them for my nephew. And I thought, oh, how can we use those at work? And I'll show you what they are. We had 4 different buzzers. Focus, too much detail. Pause for thought. That was a play on word with pause, dog, because we'd make this sign. That was to get people to stop when the tension was getting too much, and give way was let someone else talk because you've talked for too long. So that was a very cheap way of, we'd have a different person do it in charge of the buzzers for each meeting, and we'd use that to help bring discipline. And the good thing was with this is that we only had to use it for about 2 weeks, and then people got into the habit of doing it for themselves. And that's ideally what I think a nudge should be, is that it has a limited time lifespan because you've changed the behavior. We also use Slack for anyone that uses that. We had a GIF for pause for thought because sometimes it would happen on Slack. We'd have these discussions and there's no buzzers on there. So it spilled over there, but that was very effective. And, within 2 weeks, we managed to change behavior. Then we had one around questions. So this is more the priming type of nudge. So the behavior was not thinking through consequences, long-term implications of big decisions. It would be very quickly make a decision and that would be it. So what my job was, because I was the delivery director there, was I wanted people to structure decisions in a way so that we were like taking a broad view. We were grouping together risks, not considering things in isolation. And the same for costs. When we were coming up with estimates, they were often, I felt, rushed, and I wanted people to slow down and take their time to come up with estimates and to make decisions that were going to really have a very big impact on the business. So we came up with some questions that everyone was allowed to ask at any point when we were discussing something, a big decision. So one was, compared to what? I mean, often when people would say, that sounds expensive, the reply would be, well, compared to what? And then we go, oh, actually, yeah, let's think it through. Compared to what? Compared to doing what we do now, which is expensive and we lose money, for example, what we just carry on the way we are. I suppose it makes you think outside the status quo. What do you know that I don't know was a good one to help someone else, provide them with the opportunity to tell you why they come to that decision. Because quite often we have hidden information, I think, where we know from experience or whatever it might be that this is the right way to do it, but we haven't disclosed all that information. So that was a good way of getting disclosure. Why did we fail? Now, I know a lot of people will use pre-mortems, but we weren't, and that was a great way to help with planning bias and availability bias. And will we regret this? It sounds like a simple question, but it does make you, the more you regret something, the more you say, yeah, I'll really regret it if we get it wrong, suggests that we need to think about whether we ought to do it or not. So a series of simple questions which had a really big impact on the way that we made decisions. Now, it didn't solve everything, but it did at least give people the opportunity to challenge, and in a fair way that meant that people took the time to reconsider decisions. There's a leadership nudge. So if you've read Turn the Ship Around, you'll know this. This was the question. So the behavior was, we were in command and control, and obviously that's no way to run a business. You're not getting people to think for themselves. You're not encouraging people to learn and take leadership, push leadership down to every level. So to help with that, we adopted the question that was it L. David Marquette used when he was on board a nuclear submarine, and he wanted to find out from other people what they had planned so that he didn't have to make every single decision. It's the same in our workplace. You would ask people, how do you intend to do that? Rather than telling them, and it gives them the chance to then answer. There's an implied solution in the answer, and then a nudge to tell. And what that would do is we turn that around. What would then happen is people would come up, and so after we'd done it for a while, we then said, no, we want to hear it the other way around. We want you to come and say, this is how I intend to do it. And then if you've read the book, the goal is to then move on to this is what I've done. But that was probably the most successful nudge we've had, and I have actually used that in other places. It really is a great way to help other people take responsibility and push decisions to people who have the knowledge at the right level. We had one around place your bets. So this was, you can see there's a theme here around estimating. I mean, I'm talking to BAs. I guess you know a lot about this. So we're all rubbish at it. We don't like to admit it. We find ways to help do it better. And this was one that I came across reading a book called How to Measure Everything, which I think, How to Measure Anything. I don't know if anyone has read that. But one of the great nudges in there, I think, is it's called equivalence bets. So what we were doing is we were just estimating and we were guessing. And that sort of rule of thumb using heuristics was letting us down. We were losing an enormous amount of money because we weren't thinking things through. So we then had something called, have you placed your bets? So when we came up with estimates, you would ask, have you placed your bets? And what that would be is for each estimate, we'd ask people to come up with a 90% confidence level between a range. And we keep going until the point we'd say, right, if I offered you the opportunity, if I offered you a 9 in 10 chances to win £1,000, would you take your estimate or would you take the bet? And when you get to the point when they're equivalent and they can't choose between them, you'd win 1,000 either way, then you've got a good estimate. And it helps you, rule out because when you try to do this, sometimes people will go for a, massive threshold, but then you can narrow that down if you introduce the equivalence bet. There's a lot of research, by the way, for these equivalence bets being as effective as gambling with your own money. So you'll find that in Thinking Fast and Slow. There are many examples. The last nudge was around better information and disclosure. So this was trying to help a way of dealing with the lack of transparency about how people felt about work and giving feedback and being open. So this would regularly, we'd have huge fights and overheated discussions because people weren't able to articulate how they felt without someone criticizing or feeling like they were being criticized. So what we did was we collected feedback. So we did an anonymous survey. We also took an outside view by asking other people in other project managers or delivery managers how their work was and what were the big issues that they were facing. We collated that feedback and then we published the results at work. So we publicly disclosed how we rated ourselves against some core competencies with the sector, so that everyone could see we weren't performing that well. And then what we did from that, we helped the teams plan their response. So to come up with actions to close the gap between where we were, and this is how we rated ourselves. It wasn't anyone else. This is how everyone had a chance to rate ourselves against the sector. So it's a great way of using disclosure to try to influence people's behaviour and want to solve the problem. So those are the 6 we tried. We did consider more ambitious nudges, and I've just put some examples down here. I think these are all more around, I think it's Richard Thaler that talks about it's human characteristics that for the bigger nudges, the more important ones, it's things, he has 3 things that he says, characteristics of that humans that we need to, these longer term nudges can help us overcome. And they're around bounded rationality, so what the edge of our understanding of something. And then there's self-control, which I refer to where we struggle with what we do, especially when other people aren't around. And the last is about being misled by social influences. And I think we've got a lot of that right now, haven't we? We think about our own, maybe Prime Minister and the President of America. Those 3 things apply. And that's what I think with the longer, more ambitious nudges, you're entering that realm. And I would say that although we thought about these things, I'm not sure they're right for the workplace. And I think it would take an enormous amount of effort and maybe not for enough reward. I mean, I had lofty dreams about us being able to create our values through choice architecture and being able to model the implications of your actions at work if you chose a certain way of working. But I think maybe beyond this and not being more of a natural qualified psychologist. But there was a couple in there. I think publishing team goals with a verification method. I think we will do that where I'm working now, and that's as simple as publishing a blog around what your goals are that you share with your company, and you get other people to monitor to see if you're actually hitting them. Is a good way of that. Public disclosure is a great way of helping people to achieve their goals. The one around team health, when the lockdown ends, and how we nudge people to make good choices for themselves, that is something we're going to do in my new company, because I think everyone is going to have to work in a different way. So thinking of some nudges that we can help people to make better choices for themselves, and that will be things like traveling to work, whether you need a meeting, just integrating people back into the workplace. So we did consider them, but I think that the level we were at for the experiments, probably the right level for nudges in the workplace. So what we learned, you have to be clear about your motives. As you probably glean now, you can manipulate people, and you have to be really careful about that. And that's the next point. Consider the ethics of what you're doing. What are you asking people to do? Because it needs to be good. You can, and you would have experienced this with salespeople, you can use nudges as a way to get people to do things they don't want to do or they don't agree with. So be clear about your motives. Consider the ethics of what you're doing. Don't overuse it. My example of that is the Mac operating system update, which I routinely dismissed for probably about 5 years now. So my computer's probably not safe, but every time it pops up, I'm like, oh, I'll do it tomorrow, do it tomorrow. So there's an example of overuse. Involve everyone. So if you're on a team and you're going to use a nudge, everyone has to be involved. It can't be top down. Get feedback. These will only work, nudges, if you can get feedback from the people that are using them, and also feedback on the nudge itself. So you're giving people feedback as part of that nudge. It's not a tick box thing, so that's something that I'm going to keep repeating. It's if you try and achieve, atomistic approach to it, it will fail because it's too complicated. And the point with these is to try something that's cheap and easy to do. Send signals that are consistent with the desired action. I think very much something that people who lead our countries could learn from at the moment. What do you want people to do? And that's what you should signal. If you're not, and be consistent about it. If you're saying one thing one day and one day the next, then people are going to get confused and they won't do what you would like them to do. Inadvertent signaling. So this is where you have to be careful that by if you tell people that 70% of the workplace aren't completing their timesheets, for example, then what will then happen is more people will not do them because they think, well, if I'm doing it and they're not, then why am I doing it? So you have to be careful. It's better to positively frame things that 70% of the people in the office are doing their timesheets, and that helps us to achieve X, rather than to focus on the ones that aren't, because the people who are will then not do it. Start small, cheap, testable, disposable. Like we went with things that we could just, if it failed, it wasn't a problem. It didn't affect anyone. There was no heavy sanction. It just became part of our work environment, and people enjoyed it. But it was easy and cheap, so we didn't have to spend any money, which helps if you have to convince other people of the need or that you want to do it because it's inexpensive. And the last one is that you will get errors. So think of try and think up front what they are, and then design to cope with those. So that what I'd like you to remember, I think it's an important thing that we're all choice architects directly or indirectly, and think of how many times a day you ask people to make a decision. How you frame the context is so important to that decision. So you need to, whether you do it in a positive way, loss or gains, broad framing, so grouping things together that need to be part of that decision, how you help people think about long-term consequences. That context you give them will definitely influence the decision. So you need to start, if you don't already, designing a sort of framework for a decision to help people make a good choice for themselves. Again, the same point again, just think it through. It's really important. We're all human, and context affects the choices we make. And just remember that we're all human. We make mistakes. We don't always think of the right thing at the right time. And we're easily influenced, especially when we lack self-control. Nudges are not a panacea. And if you go and search for nudges now, you will read, there's a series of articles called 10 Years of Nudges, which I'd recommend. If you just search for that, you'll find them. Because there's many of them that show that it does work, but many that show that it doesn't work in certain situations. And what works in one place won't necessarily work in another. And the last thing is that, the thing to focus on is helping people to be present in that moment so they can stop and think, am I doing the right thing? So the last thing is, the reason I wanted to mention this is because Adrian and I, it was very strange. We spoke 2 weeks ago about this, And I said about nudges, and I bet they're not going to be seen in a great way because of the herd mentality, not the herd mentality, sorry, herd immunity that was suggested by someone from the behavioural insights team. There were so many things that weren't being done, which I thought would harm nudges and nudge theory. And then only 2 days ago, there was an article in The Guardian pretty much dismantling all the good that nudge theory has done, which I don't think is fair. But so I think nudges with the COVID-19. So where I think nudges could have helped would have been sending signals consistent with desired action. I really think of like masks one day, not wearing a mask, wearing a mask. You know, how much exercise you get a day. I thought it was an hour a day, but I've been told it's not true. You can go out for longer than that. But so those sort of mixed messages, look what it's done. We are really struggling with it in the UK. The curse of bounded rationality. We're all experts and we're not experts, and that knowing what the limit of what we understand and being honest about that is key to coming up with something that can nudge people to make the right decision. Temptation versus self-control. I mean, I think more could have been done to help people understand why it's important to not go out and not do things. And that ties in, don't be misled by social influence. That literally is why nudges are a good idea, is to take it away from all of the stuff that you hear from people that are trying to get you to do one thing. Find something that will help people to not be misled by that. And the last thing is the costs and benefits and long-term impact of us being in lockdown and what it will do. There doesn't seem to be have been enough of that, about doing it in a way that makes people realize that it's not a good idea to go out without panicking and scaring people half to death. And I think, if they'd had someone in control of the communications or advising it in these daily briefings, it would have made a huge difference. If it had been consistent and they'd stuck to the same thing and kept reiterating it. So that is that, I guess. So that's the end. I hope you learned something. If you've got any questions, that would be great. We can talk about nudges that we did where I worked, what you think of them. Have you used them? Any unusual ones that I haven't mentioned? More widely about discussions about nudges in the workplace, and also about maybe how nudges could have helped with, or could still help with, our current situation.
Fantastic. That was fascinating. Really, really good stuff, Andy. So if you are attending this webinar live, please do feel free to type questions in the Q&A box, and we'll cover as many as we can. And we've got a few coming in, but just while they're coming in, Andy, what I was thinking about as you were talking, I was thinking about all the different nudges that we see in life, and I was thinking about one. This took me way back to my childhood, when. And I'm guessing we're probably in a similar sort of age range, so you might remember this too, when all of a sudden there was a BBC micro computer in the classroom.
Yeah.
And that, I gather, I didn't know at the time, but that was a government scheme to put a computer in every school or classroom or whatever. Which I suppose is an example of a nudge. It's the government saying, well, we want the next generation to be computer literate, so let's put a computer in every classroom.
Yeah, it is. I think that's and I do remember that. And I remember when our school got one, it was the size of a paving slab. Yeah. Well, it obviously worked because I got interested in computers at school with a BBC computer. I ended up owning an Acorn Electron and a Spectrum. The Acorn Electron, which is a BBC, which was the more modest. So yeah, I mean, and there'll be things like that. I think all of us at some point at school would have had some kind of nudge.
Yeah.
My kids get it all the time. Like, the technology is so part of their school life that they have all kinds of apps for school. We get homework reminders. They get all kinds of. We're getting them at the moment to do with the schoolwork. So I guess technology has always been a facilitator of nudges, I guess.
Yeah. And then the other thing that randomly sprang to mind, and this probably says far too much about me, Andy, but I tend to bring everything back to beer. And I was thinking, well, it's sort of interesting, isn't it? Because like in the UK, we drink beer in pints. And there's no real reason why it should be a pint and not 2/3 of a pint or 250 millilitres or whatever. But you go to different countries and they have different quantities as standard. I guess that's like a nudge, isn't it? It's sort of saying, here is a sensible quantity for a drink. And then we just kind of accept it without question.
I think, yeah, you do get nudged to drink. What do you think of table service is a nudge, isn't it? People coming up and asking you if you'd like a more beer, or can I get you anything? Or, you know, it's not, yeah, I think shops in particular, that once you've read that book and you go into shops, you see so many people trying to get you to do things that you maybe don't want to do. Do you want to buy something, free samples, the smells, people priming? So when people are talking to you, they're putting ideas and you're anchoring. I don't know if you know about anchoring.
Yeah.
These are like dark arts, I think, of psychology and nudges. So yeah, everywhere you go, I promise you, after you've heard this, you'll start thinking, what are you asking me? What are you trying to get me to do?
Yeah. And it is that fine line with the ethics as well. But good. So we've got lots of questions coming in. So the first question comes from Maria. And Maria says, I'm hooked and will be incorporating them into my change plans. What nudges can you see in play at the moment in terms of government regarding COVID-19? So I know you spoke about that sort of generally, Andy, but do you think there's any sort of successful nudges in the COVID-19?
Yeah, I think things like the 2 meters. I mean, I think everyone knows that. I think I'm just trying to think what else. There's been quite a lot of public disclosure. So yeah, that's been good and bad. Don't think it's always been good, but I mean, I think having different people each day at the briefings has been not good. You know, if you want to keep the same message coming across, but I think the mainly ones about the 2 meters. I think about taking exercise. The ones that haven't worked well, the masks, we still don't know. But I think, yeah, mainly that you know to stay in and that there's 2 meter distance. So that's been done well, and I think we all. The thing that we've got to work on is that the longer term implications, like the benefit now to going out, what's the cost going to be in the future?
Yeah. I was also thinking, Andy, as you were speaking there, that one thing, I mean, I must admit, when it started, I was watching the press briefing every day. It gets to the point where now I just read the highlights. but one thing when I do watch it, they have the graph of like in the infections and COVID-19 deaths, which is obviously very, very sad. But they also have like public transport use. And there's sort of like a social pressure there, isn't there? It's like, look, nobody's using public transport anymore, so don't. Like, if you don't need to go out, don't. Which is kind of, I guess, a sort of a social compliance nudge in a way.
That's worked, yeah. So peer pressure. So that's a really good example, actually. So thank you for that. Is the public transport tubes that is just being used by people that need to use it. So the public disclosure there. There's also, I guess, publishing data around the infection rates of cities around or where you live is another great way of disclosing information. So it's encouraging you to make the right decision, which is don't go out.
Definitely. Maria has a second question, which is a broad one. Actually, this next one, Andy, to be fair, we could probably talk about for an hour. So it's a bit of a tricky one to put you on the spot for. But nudges for adopting agile. Any ideas or experience?
Well, I do that. I mean, I'm actually doing that at the moment. And that is one of the things that I was going to ask the team. So I could come back with an answer for that. Oh, nudges. I think I suppose we have public disclosure through. We're using Kanban as an example.
Yeah.
So you've got your board, haven't you? That's public disclosure. So you're being open and transparent. So nudges. I think it's. Oh God, it's this difficult one to answer, isn't it? Oof.
I think that
I do.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's hard to answer. I would have to spend a bit of time thinking about that. Mainly what I spend my day is really helping people understand the benefits and coaching more rather than So you are, I did actually have something in the slide and I took it out. You are a walking nudge, I think, if you work in delivery. And like you're always, it's the questions you help people to answer, but you don't answer them yourselves. And I think some of those questions of consequences, encouraging those as ways of helping people to understand what agile, I know it's going to be cliche, it's a mindset, isn't it? And it's more about how you think. It's about, what was I explaining it to someone else today? You know, limiting, so nudges to limiting work in progress. Well, I guess you'd use things like they do on social media. So some way to show when you're hitting a limit and going over. So like a red is a very good way of showing. That's what we do. We have a red label for blocker on our Kanban board. When something, what else would it be? I mean, that's off the top of my head, but it's mainly the questions, I think, would be the nudges. Like, how do you intend? I think that's for agile. You're asking people to come up with what are you going to do? You're not telling them how to do it. And I guess there's always that tension between what and how, isn't there, with agile, and where it is in the process. But I'd say that would be a good place to start, using those types of questions.
Definitely. Fantastic. So our next question is from Mary France, who asks, do you have any examples or suggestions around how to nudge people to collaborate across departmental silos, and how to incentivize people to think of the bigger picture? Gosh, you're getting really tricky questions here, Andy. but good questions.
Yeah. That is a difficult one, because I've been there. I think they're so being open and transparent. Feedback, we've said about feedback, seeking feedback, collaboration. How have I done that in the past? I think it's mainly around disclosure. So you use disclosure to tell people about what you're doing, and do that regularly. Regular communication. So think about what was the, let me see if I can go back one. There we go. So send signals consistent with the desired action. So what is it you want from the other teams? And I would say that's where I would start. It's trying to get across what you're there and you want to help people. So when I've done it, I've published, we have week notes where I work. So I use those to, if people don't know what week notes are, it's just a way of writing, too long didn't read at the top, a summary of what your team's doing. And then you go into more details about what your goal was for that week and what the outcomes and whether you achieved them, and then what you're going to do for the next week. And we publish those and send them to all of the heads of departments and say, share them with anyone else that you think needs to see them. And what I occasionally do is put in something controversial. And it works. I put a few things in that you get. I put a bit of humor in there, just to try and get across that we're not machines. And I think that's what often happens with silos, isn't it? You've got to get across that you're human, you're doing a job, and this is how you can. So the other thing I would do, so week notes, and then how you can help. Because I think where you volunteer ways of helping, especially if you can help another team achieve a goal, then that's what I do. But so nudge would be put your goals and disclose what you're working on, and put it on whatever your company, your intranet, SharePoint, however you do it, Azure DevOps, or you use Confluence. Use those tools as a way of publicly sharing what you do, and then inviting people to comment on it would be the first thing I can think of. And be consistent in what you want.
Yeah, that consistency of communication as well. So good. Okay, so our next question comes from Nefra, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Nefra. Apologies if I'm not. But Nefra asks, I've been considering nudges in terms of how to present guidance on use of a new system. Not too much, not too little, but to make it easy, help them to comply. Have you ever used it for guidance docs? And do you have any top tips for this particular application of nudge theory?
I mean, I think with that, it's trying to think of like defaults that what do you want? What's the outcome that you're trying to achieve in the context that you're in? So I think it's defaults are very powerful. So it's writing a guidance in a way that you set a default of this is what it will be if you don't do anything, would be what I would suggest. You think of that default, and then if people need to change it, then they're going to have a good reason why. But you say this is how it is, this is how it's going to work, this is the default. So use power of defaults. Other than that, I think it's nudging people to read them has been my right guidance. It's some way of getting them to show that there's a reason to read it, and this is what the benefit is. So the cost and benefit. So the benefit of you reading this, the cost of it is you've got to invest up front to reading it, but the benefit will be that you get X, Y, or Z. So those are what I would suggest.
Yeah, it's interesting.
What do you think, Kate?
Well, I was just thinking about like getting people to read guidance notes, or it's just hard, isn't it? And I was just thinking about something I did recently in a sort of a bit of a different context, but I needed to get people to read like a top eight things I needed them to know and think about. And I was like, you just put it as text, and it's just like paragraphs that are going to. It just people just going to ignore it, and. I came up with this crazy idea. What if I formatted it, or got some help from someone I know who's a very good sort of designer, to make it look like one of those safety cards you get on an aeroplane.
Yeah.
And it's like there. I don't know whether novelty is a nudge, but like the novelty became the nudge, because it's like, well, it was almost like, well, here's your pre-flight checks, you know. So then there was this metaphor about, you know, it borrowed a metaphor from flying about, you know, let's do the sort of safety checks type of thing. So maybe we can borrow from other industries.
Flexible thinking is definitely. What did I think when you were saying that? I guess with guidance, it's getting people to do it. It's giving them the information at the right time as well. That's, I think, very important. So I think defaults, like I said, try and do it in a way that makes it more appealing. Show people the benefit of doing it versus the cost. So it might take a bit of time to read now, but you will be able to do this in future. And the consequence of not reading it. I mean, if I can be so bold to say, if you don't read this, then the following will happen.
Definitely. So we've got a couple of minutes left, Andy. So I'm going to try and apologies if we haven't been able to get to your question yet, but I'll try and bundle a few up just very, very briefly. So firstly, quite a few people are asking about whether the session's being recorded. Yes, absolutely. So if you're attending live, you'll get an email with a link to that recording. Gertje says, more of a comment, she says, nudging towards agile can be done by asking questions, maybe having people thinking about their behavior, which is a good one. So that's a really interesting aspect. Lawrence asks, which book would you recommend first for someone starting to nudge? Would that be the nudge book you'd recommend first, Andy?
Yeah. I mean, yes, because I think the other one is too. It'll give you such an insight, but into psychology generally, yeah. But I'd say go for nudge first, because you can get cracking with that. And if you want to even a quicker way, a more efficient way, let's say, then go for the East framework. Search for East framework, you'll find, although it is for policy advisors, the main one, there's so much in there that you can take. I mean, that might be the previous question. Policy is a bit like guidance, isn't it? So that I would have a look at the East framework as the quick way to get yourself, enough information for you to start experimenting.
Yeah. And finally, and again, this will have to be our last question, unfortunately, but very briefly, Adiola asks, well, first he says, thank you so much for this, Andy, for this webinar.
I work with Adiola.
Oh, right. Oh, fantastic. It's amazing, and one that I'll definitely be making use of. But any situations where nudges won't be as effective as they ought to be?
I think it's the ethics thing. Yeah, I think that's when it. Well, we know some of them. It's the way they've been used now with coronavirus. It's ethics that. There are many, if it's not ethical to do it, because you can you can find a way to nudge people to frame the context of a decision. And we've all, well, I've done it. I've created the framework, the context to get the decision that I wanted. But was that the right one for the team? Was it the right one for me in that moment? And I think that's when it's not right. It shouldn't be for personal gain. It's probably most powerful when you do it for a larger group of people, a team, your company, or a group of society. Because if it's just for you, that's not, someone else has to lose, or it's detrimental to them. So I say that it's the ethics. If it's just for you, then it's wrong, would be my rule of thumb.
Fantastic. Well, Andy, thank you so much. And again, for those of you attending live, apologies for the questions we couldn't get to. There are some interesting ones there. So Andy, you mentioned that you're on Twitter. Are you happy for people to contact you there, and like LinkedIn and so forth, to keep the conversation going?
Yeah, so I apologise if I couldn't give full answers for the questions, but I'm one of those, but I'm quite, not that you'd know, quite introverted. So give me a chance to have a think about it. And if I can't answer it, then I can definitely send you some articles, as I've read a lot about nudges now. And I think I could probably point you in the right direction.
Fantastic. Well, Andy, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to be here. I mean, I've read the books, and yet this was a really insightful summary. And I gained a huge amount from it, as I'm sure everyone listening in did as well, certainly by the number of comments coming in. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time out. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in live, or indeed is watching the recording. As a reminder, really the idea behind these webinars, or these series of webinars, I started doing them, I think, in 2017 under the hashtag BA Community Webinar. And the idea really, I mean, I'm a business analyst by sort of trade and training, was to create a series of webinars about stuff that's perhaps not core to business analysis or change, but that we probably ought to know about and be thinking about in the community. And I think nudging is certainly one of those things. Now, with that in mind, there are a whole bunch of other webinars coming up. With the current sort of lockdown, I'm trying to do one a week where I can, rather than one a month, so folks have got stuff to tune into and think about when we're perhaps stuck at home a little bit more. So if you're tuning live, when you exit out, you'll actually go to the list of webinars. So feel free to sign up to as many of them as you want, and keep an eye on those. You'll also get a link to a questionnaire after the webinar as well. One of the things I'm always looking for is topics. So if there's a topic you want to hear more about, please put it in the questionnaire. I'll see if I can find someone to talk about it. Equally, if you're listening in thinking, I'd really want to talk about X, then let me know, because if you're enthusiastic about a subject that would benefit the community, like the change community, then let's get a webinar set up. So a very, very good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks again, Andy, and hope to catch up with everyone soon.